Hey, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens and this is English Nerd. So today, in preparation for NaNoWriMo and just in general because I am in the process of writing a novel, I wanted to talk to you about a few ways that you can make the description of your setting really come alive and actually contribute to your overall story in a meaningful way. Now, I know that some people really enjoy elaborate descriptions of setting. You know, some people really like the Lord of the Rings, Once and Future King style of just a lot of description. Other people don't enjoy that really much at all. No matter how much setting you like, here are 3 ways that you can improve your setting descriptions and really integrate them into the story in a meaningful way. So here we go. Are you ready? I'm ready. Number 1. You want to make sure that your description is through the eyes of the narrator. Now, this works even for third-person narration. What does the main character think about this new place that he's come to, or what does she think about when she sees this forest? Is it a frightening reaction that she has to it? What details does she zone in on that have to do with her own life? So I want to just share a couple ways that this can practically look. You know, how can you describe your setting through the eyes of your protagonist? So I'm currently reading A Court of Thorns and Roses. So far I'm really liking it, but I'm not super far in, so hopefully I like the rest. But one thing I noticed right away is that Sarah J. Maas integrates the setting description with the character development really, really well. So just to give you an example of that, let me read a passage for you. Don't worry, there will be no spoilers in this video because I have not read far enough for there to really be spoilers. So at the beginning of the story, the protagonist Farah goes to her village market, and it says that there were the stone houses of the village. They were ordinary and dull, made grimmer by the bleakness of winter, but it was market day, which meant that the tiny square in the center of town would be full of whatever vendors had braved the brisk morning. From a block away, the scent of hot food wafted by, spices that tugged on the edge of my memory, beckoning. So it's a short description of the town. There really isn't a whole lot more than this. It's scattered throughout the scene, but you can tell that even in that short passage, which is, oh my goodness, that's so bright, which is right there, you can see that the houses are ordinary and dull. That is a value statement, at least dull is. So that tells us something about her. Made grimmer by the bleakness of winter, so it's not just a description of the place itself, but also the time, so it kind of pulls double shifts there. And then the smell of hot food. Anytime you can bring in scent, that's a really great way to enhance a description of a setting. And in this case, of course, she would notice the hot food smells coming in because she and her family are so poor that they're starving. And so the spices tug on the edge of her memory, beckoning. So we learn not only to be immersed in this town, but we learn something about the main character as well. On the very next page, she and her sisters meet these characters that are wearing real silver bracelets. And it stops to emphasize the real silver because Farah is somebody who notices the cost of items, and when somebody has a luxury item, she starts converting that to how much food her family could eat based on how much that would cost. So I thought that that was really impressive. Not only does she describe the setting, but she manages to get some character development just in the way she describes it, and some other aspects of the story in there as well. So in my own novel that I'm writing, it's not coming out for a few months, but I'm going to just mention it as an example anyway. The main character, Firian, was going to be a glassmaker like his father at the beginning of the story. Events happen that change the trajectory of his life, but throughout the rest of the descriptions, he almost always notices windows or glass throughout in the different settings because that's where his eye normally is drawn because he knows about how glassmaking works. So that's the first thing I would say. Match your description to the character's perception of it rather than having it be its own thing. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, on to tip number 2. You can set a mood in addition to describing your setting, and I would suggest that as much as possible you should, by just making sure that the words you use have a consistent connotation, maybe positive, maybe negative, maybe associated with joy or with fear, or with even something less obvious like being fragile or something like that. So let me show you an example from a very different book. This time it's going to be The Picture of Dorian Gray, because I love that story so much. Just look at this. This, for whatever reason, has stuck in my mind for years and years and years as just a killer description that is very aware of the word connotations and in the overall description of the setting. So well, I guess I don't need to give you any context, and besides, it would probably require spoilers, so I would just recommend that you read this book, and I'll pick up with my description here. The moon hung low in the sky like a yellow skull. From time to time, a huge misshapen cloud stretched a long arm across and hid it. The gas lamps grew fewer, and the streets more narrow and gloomy. Once, the man lost his way and had to drive back half a mile. A steam rose from the horse as it splashed up the puddles. The side windows of the hansom were clogged with a gray flannel mist. I mean, that's just gorgeous, but how does it work? The way that this works is that we have a very consistent mood through the entire setting description. So again, the description is not merely describing, but it's actually getting across the mood, the atmosphere of the scene, the mood of the character as he's going through these streets. And he does that by making sure that not only is the word choice consistently negative and creepy, but the analogies he chooses as well. You shouldn't just choose an analogy that you think works necessarily, when you can instead use an analogy that really enhances the mood or reveals that character, like we saw with Farah in A Court of Thorns and Roses. Here, for instance, we have a couple of analogies. We have the moon being compared to a yellow skull. That's creepy and effective. And then we have clouds reaching like a long, misshapen arm. So you get the clouds are personified there, but again in a negative way, just as the moon was described in a negative way. It's not just an arm reaching across, you know, caressing or embracing or anything like that. It's a long, misshapen arm in the darkness, and that obviously brings much creepier ideas to mind. So I just think that Oscar Wilde does this particularly well. Number 3, in order to create the best setting that you possibly can, make it come alive for the reader. And a super simple way to do this is just by using multiple kinds of imagery. And I know imagery is one of those words that your English teacher probably threw around and maybe didn't define as much as he or she should have. So imagery is just sense description, that's it. So sight imagery would be what do things look like? Auditory imagery would be what do they sound like, etc. So use more than one or even 2 senses if you can. There's no need to use all 5 senses. I know there's some bad advice going around out there that says that every scene needs to be described using all 5 senses. That's nonsense. I mean, just try working taste into every scene and you'll realize that that is at times horrifying and at best kind of clunky. But if you can, work in 3 or 4. You know, use that smell like I mentioned before. Use sight, use sound, use smell. What do things feel like? So a great example of this technique, using multiple kinds of imagery, I think is in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. So we're all over the place today. We have modern works, we have some older works, we have British, American, Russian. It's good times all around. A good description is a good description. So in One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, Ivan is in the Russian Gulag, which is a labor camp, and this story literally describes a typical day for him in that labor camp, and it's described moment by moment, painstaking moment by moment, but it's super well done. It's another book that you should read, and as far as Russian literature goes, that's as short as it's gonna get, folks. So Here is a passage that uses multiple kinds of imagery. It was like a bathhouse inside. Whenever the door opened, frosty air mingled with steam from the skilly. Some work gangs were sitting at tables, others were blocking the aisles, waiting for vacant places. 2 or 3 workers from every gang shouted and shoved their way through the mob, carrying bowls of skilly and gruel on wooden trays and looking for a space to put them down on. Must be deaf, the blockhead. Take that for bumping the tray and making me spill the stuff. That's it, use your free hand. Give him one in the neck. That's the stuff. You there, don't get in the way looking for leftovers. So I don't want to read you the entire scene. It's a little bit on the lengthy side, but this is breakfast in the mess hall, and we get immediately the sense of touch, of feeling when the frosty air comes in to the mess hall with this steam, almost like a bathhouse, which is so good in and of itself. So you get that sense of feeling. You also get a view of what's happening, and Solzhenitsyn basically makes you a character in this scene, which is really unusual, but a topic for another time. He goes on in this scene to describe exactly how Ivan eats his food. He eats it very slowly, very thoughtfully, and methodically so that he can get as much satisfaction and nutrition from it as he possibly can. And so you have taste in this, you have touch in this, you have people shouting, you have just a lot of sensory description happening in this scene that I think is really effective. So play around with this, see what works, see what doesn't, but if you're not used to using senses like smell or touch, start working those into some scenes, and I think that you'll find it's an easy way to start bringing those scenes alive to your readers. Okay, the last tip that I have for you is not something that everybody should do, but I think that it can be really effective as well to make your setting significant in the story, kind of like its own character. So again, not everybody needs to do this, but you can make your setting symbolic as well. This works particularly well for short stories. So I don't have a copy of Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, there we go, with me, but Hills Like White Elephants is a short story that is really simple. There are 2 characters, a man and a woman, who are having a beer, as like every Hemingway character does. In this train station, they're waiting for a train, and so the train tracks kind of split the setting, if you will. On one side, we have this pretty barren landscape. On the other side, it's more lush, and in the distance, they can see these hills. And the analogy, like white elephants, is really important to the story as a whole, because white elephants were these grand gifts that were given to kings, I believe, that were enormously rare and enormously valuable on the one hand, but also nobody wanted to receive a white elephant because they were so expensive to take care of. And all of those ideas, the ideas of waiting for a place to go to make a decision, there being 2 sides to a question, the idea of hills being like white elephants involved in the story. The setting is the only thing that really makes the story make sense. It is symbolic in every conceivable way. I won't tell you exactly what it's about, you can read it for yourself. It's only a couple pages long, and if you know anything about Hemingway, the sentences are like 3 words long and everybody just says, "Más cerveza, por favor." But anyway, it is a great short story and a great illustration of how you can use setting as a symbolic device. Another short story that I would recommend that does this well is Catherine Mansfield's The Garden Party. My goodness, it's like there's a strobe light in my face. But The Garden Party also has 2 settings. There is the affluent society, and there are the poor people as well. And the poor literally live down the hill from the affluent people. And not only is the position indicative of the difference between the classes, but also the description of each area. Going back to what Oscar Wilde did with the obvious connotation of the words being positive or negative, Catherine Mansfield does something pretty similar. So I know this is kind of a long, rambly discussion of how you can make your setting more interesting, but just to wrap up, once again, that is number 1, look at the setting through the eyes of your protagonist. Number 2, be really intentional about your word choice and your analogies. Number 3, use different kinds of imagery, not the same all the time. You know, sight and hearing, there's more to be had and explored after that. And then finally, especially if you're writing a short story, you can feel free in a novel to do this as well, but especially if you're writing a short story, consider ways that you can make your setting symbolic as well. So that's all I have for you today. Hopefully that was helpful. I know there are lots of other ways for your setting description to pop, so if you have those, be sure to comment below and subscribe if you haven't already. I hope you enjoyed this. I guess I'll see you next Monday.